Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this very rainy and cold day in Washington. I just want to first start off by thanking the Hudson Institute for hosting us, and the Federalist Society and the ABA Standing Committee on National Security for co-hosting this event with us. We have some people in the audience today, but we also have a large audience online. And we just want to thank everyone for joining us and for joining the PIDB in this discussion that we're going to have today on reforming the classification and declassification system. So with that, I just want to say today, I'm Ezra Cohen. I'm the chair of the Public Interest Declassification Board. And I'm joined by my vice chair, Alyssa Starzak, who is the vice chair of the PIDB and has been a great partner over the past 2 years as we've frankly made a lot of progress in advocating for reforming the classification and the declassification system. So I think just to start off the conversation, Alyssa, you've been on the board for a little bit longer than me. Where do you see things going, and how do you think, what type of progress have we been making recently?
Well, thanks to everyone for having me here. And again, thanks to everyone that Ezra mentioned. I completely agree. And it's worth, I think, talking a little bit about what the board is to begin with. So the board actually looks at public interest declassification like its title. So we really try to think about things like declassification policy. We sometimes get individual requests on declassification, but we really have we're a liaison in a lot of ways to different communities just on the questions of declassification. So we think we can play a really important role in thinking long-term about how we improve classification and declassification policy in the government. And I think one of the things I've been really impressed by, we've done a lot of work, as you know very well, Ezra, over the course of the year on a lot of different projects. We've had some individual classification requests that have come up as a board, including ones from members of Congress. But we've also been trying to think long-term about how we can think about electronic records in particular, because I think what we've seen over the past 20, 30 years, I don't know even how long it's been, is a sort of explosion of classified records, but also sort of systems in place that where we can actually do more to systematize both the classification and declassification process. So I think one of the things that we've really sort of focused on across the board is thinking about that as a matter of policy, so that down the road we can really do a better job, be more consistent in how we declassify, and have systems in place that enable it to be easier for people. Because I think what often happens in classification is that if you're working in the world of national security, the easiest thing to do is to classify. And so we want to create systems that recognize that the sort of day-to-day can be challenging for people who work in the national security world, that may still be the reality, but if you can create mechanisms to sort of check and to sort of look at it from a technical standpoint, or a technology standpoint, there's a lot of potential room for improvement and declassification down the road.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. When you look at when the U.S. government digitized, and basically mid-1990s, that's really when digitization really kind of took off. Advent of email and really the number of records being created exploded. We're now reaching the 25-year, mandatory point at which many of these documents are going to have to be reviewed. And so I think that, one thing we've seen over the past year is that this kind of deferral of the problem, we'll deal with that later, is now really coming into people's minds who probably do have a lot of other national security priorities. This is finally coming to the front of their mind because there is this kind of tsunami of records that's about to hit that need to be reviewed. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now is, and even right now as we speak, the Biden administration is looking to update and review EO 13526, which is the principal executive order that deals with the classification system.
So I'm actually going to turn it over and ask a question back to you. So, we've been thinking about the EO as a board. Are there things that you have been specifically considering on the executive order itself that can help improve declassification policy, or how much of it is in an executive order and how much isn't?
Yeah, so I think there are some structural things. Right now, the classification system is largely run by the agencies. There seems to be kind of, and you got to this, there's this incentive to overclassify. Frankly, it's tough to be subjected to public scrutiny. Doesn't mean that, obviously the board and our belief is that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and that we need to let more sunlight in, but that's not necessarily the bureaucratic interest of the agencies. So I think right now ISU, which is the office at the National Archives that's really supposed to be policing the classification system. They're supposed to be making sure that there aren't the creation of too many compartments, or subcompartmentation, and many other parts of the classification system. I'm not sure that the National Archives is really the right place for the kind of arbiter of the classification system. For one, the archives is very focused on kind of looking back. That's the mission of the archives, is to look back in history. But when you're talking about governing the classification system going forward and reducing overclassification, I think that moving ISU to perhaps OMB or the Executive Office of the President, where it originally was located, would help kind of police the agencies.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things that we see on the board, we see the questions of historical declassification, so the 25-year mandatory declassification, and then the sort of fallout when records aren't declassified in that time frame. So we dealt with the JFK records earlier this year, which that's a long time ago. So you have this sort of historical set of records, and then you of course have sort of current events questions, and they're I think that we tend to focus more on historical things because it becomes those questions of policy. But the historical piece is a really important one too, thinking about processes in particular for sort of real-time declassification on certain things, or certainly just more current to sort of address current events as appropriate. But I think that there is a split. There are different kinds of policies, and there's sort of the proliferation of a significant number of records versus that we have to think through, and then also sort of the current events piece.
I also think that we think about the issue of classification, declassification as a largely administrative matter. But one thing we've seen, and I think the war, Russian invasion of Ukraine has really brought this to the forefront, is that overclassification hurts our ability to share with allies and partners and really allow forces other than U.S. forces to conduct an operation. And of course, the Biden administration took and really from the White House directive, took the extraordinary step of declassifying sensitive intelligence to share with our partners. But I think that is going to become much more the norm. And so, as the potential for a conflict in the Pacific increases, we need to start thinking about the fact that if we overclassify, we are going to hurt our ability to work with all of the partners that we have in the Pacific and around the world. So I think it's really about also putting more resourcing, frankly, into the system.
I think on the resourcing piece, it's also thinking about how we apply those resources well. So, in the same idea, we don't want to spend a ton of time on things that aren't really valuable from a public standpoint. I think that's the public interest component of the board. It's thinking about how to take the things that are most impactful and make sure that those get attention, and not just every record, but then also create systems where you can get rid of some of the stuff. Rid is not the right word, but where you can address classification on issues relatively easily on things that people aren't as worried about. So if you can, if that's where you can come up with automated systems of just thinking about making it easier for declassification, for example, understanding sort of what role things might play. But I do think that the goal is that prioritization piece. So really thinking on declassification of putting at the top of a sort of short list the issues that matter most to people and that will have the most impact.
I think automation is and that's something the board's looked at as well. That is, we think on the board that really is the solution to fixing this problem. Right now, if you, for instance, create a classified record within the intelligence community, the level of automation is simply saving what your default preference is for classification. And because there's only there's a negative consequence, which is that if you underclassify, you could have a negative consequence. You could lose your security clearance. If you overclassify, there's no consequence. So people just select the default, and they select the high default without thinking about it much. We view the automation not just at addressing the problem after the fact, so reviewing records that have been classified historically, but also similar to spell check. As you're writing a document, the system, based on its machine learning, will tell you what the classification of certain pieces are. And what we think is and there are a few projects throughout the government that have been working on this, that ultimately the machine being able to suggest to the human what the classification is, and then alerting, frankly, an individual supervisor, for instance, if they are habitually overclassifying, would help solve the problem. But also, for instance, let's say that we were in a situation like Ukraine again, where the president said, I want to downgrade the classification of all these categories of information. The machine, the AI algorithm would be able to do it in an automated way.
Yeah, I actually think there's some really interesting possibilities in that area. So if you can imagine, if you could, for anyone who's been in the classification world and sort of thinking about what it looks like, you have to make sure there's sort of consistent methods for classification, because that's what you're really getting at. You want things that are consistent across an agency. If you're classifying a fact, for example, because it is classified, you can find it later based on the markings that you give in the classification guide that you have. And what you find is that that's not at all true right now. Different agencies have different classification guides. You have, even within an agency, it might fall under 2 different classification guides. So you have this reality of it's just not organized in order to do things that look like long-term beneficial declassification. But if you could mark it in a way where once that topic has been declassified, it's declassified in all of the systems, would be a huge step forward. And we are very far from that right now, but I think that's the kind of system we need to aim for.
Right, absolutely. And for many of, I see we have a few members of the media here in the room, this would also help with FOIA too. Because as many of you know, the delays in FOIA are caused often by these classification issues, and the same staff that has to, in many agencies, the same staff that does the mandatory declassification reviews are also the FOIA staff as well. So there's a limited throughput. I think one thing for this EO that we've talked about as a board is creating a program office within OMB, perhaps, that is responsible for researching, developing, and then implementing an automated system like we're talking about. It's what we found is, unfortunately, one agency doesn't want to use the other agency's system. So you have a kind of duplication of research and development efforts right now across the interagency that is frankly quite inefficient, and it doesn't benefit from the knowledge that the government has in different pockets. I think one thing, just kind of as an example that we see, the board's been looking at 9/11, declassifying 9/11 records, and we did recently have a release of the Bush-Cheney MEMCON from the 9/11 Commission. But another record we've talked about is the PIDB summary, the President's Daily Brief summary, that was all of the PDBs from the Clinton and the Bush administration. leading up to 9/11. And that document's in review, but one of the problems we've faced is that there are so many different agencies that are involved in this document. It's almost, it's very difficult to decide who's responsible for what piece of information. I mean, what do you think? I mean,
Well, I actually think that highlights one of the challenges. I mean, the way we classify right now is agency specific, which you can see how that happens in reality. But like, if you think about what we want from a government, we want sort of consistent policies across the government. We don't want one agency classifying something and a different agency not classifying something, or classifying it for a completely different reason necessarily. We want sort of consistency so that if you take a fact and declassify it, it is declassified across the board, not at one agency here, but not at another agency there. And I think that's one of the challenges that we have, and we certainly see that in the 9/11 context. We have, it makes sense why agencies do that, to be fair. Like, they're looking at different sources and methods, so they may have the same facts, but it may be coming from different places. So if you're classifying for sources and methods reasons, and one of them is a signals intelligence component and one is a human intelligence piece, it might be fair that the same fact has different classification markings. But we need to think about how you take the underlying component and make sure that the sources and methods piece doesn't get in the way of the fact that the underlying fact is now out in the world, right? That you can sort of take away the fact that it came from signals intelligence, and the fact is there. The fact is there, and now the sources and methods are somewhat shielded. And so understanding some of that, I think, is important long term for how we think about those records and how we think about how we can put more out in the public. Which I actually want to sort of turn back to you, because I think, I think there's a question about why we care about all of these things at all. Why do they matter? And I think that's something that we talk about a lot at the board. So
yeah, well, look, I mean, and you're right. I mean, we should have started with that. It's just, for us, it's so automatic. But I think, the U.S. system is unique in the sense that that we really are one of the only governments in the world where there's just this assumption that every secret that the government has in present day will ultimately be available to the public, right? And, it might be a long time, but there's not this idea that something is classified forever. And, I know that the FOIA process and the MDR process and all of these declassification processes are very slow and they take a long time, but we really are significantly more open than any other country. So part of that is because there's this idea that the public will ultimately hold an agency or agencies accountable for the actions that they take, and they will, and these agencies' actions will be judged by the public. Hopefully, that being in the back of people's mind in the intelligence community and the Department of Defense will, perhaps encourage them to behave in ways that are more consistent with what the public wants, even if there is a bit of a time delay. So I think that that's really why, at its core, why it's so important.
I think I agree. It's that trust. There's a trust in government piece that comes with it, and there's on both sides, right? So the government knowing that information is going to be made public has that exactly the effect that Ezra talked about, and I think that then also feeling like there is transparency helps in the long run. I also think that there's so much we can learn from history. So this is taking the historian perspective. We should be pulling in those learnings, and if they're sort of kept secret and siloed, we don't. And so trying to come up with ways where we take the historical records and actually pull from them, get the learnings from them so that we can apply them in the future is important. I also think there's one of the things that we talk about that's a much more practical piece is that classified records are expensive to keep. So the more if you have to store everything in sort of special compartmented information facilities, right, SCIFs, it starts to get expensive after a while, right? Even in the electronic record set, they have to be kept up. They have you have to think about what the archiving looks like. There's a very practical reason for trying to come up with better systems to manage records.
Right, and I think the archives, and I've spoken to the archivist about this, or the past archivist. I mean, they are crushed under the demands to store the classified records of the U.S. government, going back 100 years. It's extremely expensive. I think another aspect of this too is that that we also, even within the government, there's an issue of overclassification. So we've talked about the outside the government piece, but within the government, because of overclassification, but also just this kind of rapid expansion of subcompartmentation, the ability of different agencies within the government and even teams within agencies to interact with each other and work with each other is really harming the mission. And I think, you know, we'll give one example that the board has looked at, although this is sort of involves the private sector, but the overclassification is driving up the cost of acquisitions for the federal government. You know, if you make an acquisition, for instance, a SAP, or you make everything a SAP, these companies then have to go out and create production facilities that they themselves are SCIFs to handle SAPs. They have to try to hire. I mean, it's hard enough in the United States right now in the current labor market to you know, for GM to hire enough workers for its assembly line. And now we're saying to these defense contractors, you have to hire hundreds of factory line workers that all have SAP level clearance. That drives up the cost of acquisition to the taxpayer, but it also means that if you over compartmentalize, teams of engineers, both on the government side and within industry, can't share research and development, which might have cross purposes with each other because of the over compartmentalization.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And we have certainly heard that from a board perspective. And it is worth understanding all of those things from a policy piece, because if you can fix some of them, if you can share information across the government, there's a lot of room for, again, lower cost, and also just development across different agencies, right? You can you can actually share information about things that are technically owned by the government that a lot of the government doesn't even know they have.
So I think to bring it back to the EO, I mean, that's really one thing that we'd like to see. We'd like to see more control over the creation of SAPs, and which are special access programs, and also CAPs, which are the IC equivalent controlled access programs. We would like to see more control over that. And again, the agencies have an interest in creating these programs. For, you know, some of them are true security. There are true security needs. I don't want to minimize that. But there are also some perverse incentives. For instance, you know, maybe shielding your program from congressional oversight, or even shielding your program from oversight from your own colleagues at the agency. So I think what we need is more control outside of the agencies, maybe at the NSC, maybe at ISOO, an ISOO that has moved to a new location before SAPs and other forms of subcompartments are created. I think that that's one thing for the EO that we'd definitely like to see. I think just changing gears a little bit now, you know, we've also talked about the board's mission. And you know, an interesting thing happened a couple of years ago. We were given a new responsibility by Congress, which is to review and kind of arbitrate disagreements over classification between the legislative branch and the executive branch. We obviously think this is an important responsibility, but it also puts an interesting burden on the board. Melissa, what do you think? You've been here for both times. So.
Yeah, you know, so it's really interesting. So the board, we're a relatively small board, right? We don't have, we're staffed by ISOO, which is, again, part of the National Archives. But the task that was given to us was think about records for declassification. So if you get referrals from Congress on declassification, take on the sort of mission of declassification. And I think what we realized in sort of looking at individual sets of records is that that's actually not the board's skill set, right? We get the sort of the broad interest in the question of declassification, but going into a document and saying, should this fact be classified, should this not, and having to go through line by line is actually not probably the best use of the board's time. There have to be better ways of classification policy where you have the ability to challenge classification decisions, where it doesn't mean taking in a board that is not expert in the area of that declassification, where we can sort of talk about the broad theme, but not necessarily the individual classification components that make up the classification of a document. And I think I was sort of struck by, we were asked for declassification, to look at declassification of a particular set of documents, and it took us just going through the document line by line with the entire board was a very long day, let me put it that way, and again, not a long document. And it was a very intensive process with lots of questions asked, as you would want it to, but again, not the most efficient use of time. So we have to, to me, what it brought home is that we really need ways of thinking about challenging classification, certainly for members of Congress, which we don't currently have, and that are not just about the board doing it, which doesn't have the resources to do that for many documents, to put it mildly.
Yeah, I think, and obviously, multi-source intelligence. So this is documents that involve sources from across different agencies has made declassification a lot more difficult. This is what we were referring to in the idea of having an automated system that it would help with that. But, I think the board, from my perspective, is an important escape valve, in that, if Congress, as part of its oversight responsibilities, really thinks that a document should be made public, and there is this disagreement with the agencies, having the board be able to make a recommendation directly of the president on whether or not something should be declassified, I think is an important escape valve to have. With that said, though, there needs to be a more routine mechanism. And, I think another thing for the EO is allowing Congress to be part of the MDR process, and allow Congress to make requests to the MDR process, which it cannot now. That's been the interpretation of the existing 13526 executive order. And let me just explain a little bit about the MDR process, because I think this is important. The MDR is kind of the lesser known cousin to FOIA. Much lesser known. But it's another mechanism available to the public to seek actually access to classified information that's classified, but for it to be declassified. It stands for Mandatory Declassification Review. And it's done through the ICECAP, which is an interagency body within the government that makes these reviews of classified records that have a large public interest. I think, when we were briefed on this, there's something like 90% of the requests to the ICECAP are accounted by, there are only 3 individuals that make up 90% of the requests. One of them is a very, I guess, well-respected Soviet-era researcher. Another one is interested in, UAPs, and I don't remember who the third is, but it might be the National Security Archive at GW. But the point is that that's another option that people have to really seek access to some of these sensitive records.
Yeah, I think the thing that it actually highlights to me, the MDR process, it's the interplay with FOIA, right? So what people don't understand about FOIA is that FOIA doesn't actually have a declassification process in it. So, FOIA is a mechanism for the public to get access to records, which makes a lot of sense. But if records are appropriately classified, then you don't get access to them as a public. That's just, sort of logical. But it's the question of how we think about the interplay between FOIA records and FOIA requests and declassification. So if there's enough public interest through FOIA, do we think about something like putting it through MDR, for example? MDR also takes a lot of time. So just to be clear on the sort of processing, it probably can't take that many records either. But I think we do need systems where we think about, again, how we prioritize the declassification of records or evaluation for declassification, because I think that's missing in many ways, and I think we could do a lot better from a government perspective on it.
Yeah, and I think that this just goes back to the resourcing issue. There are always complaints in Congress about, the executive branch not being transparent enough. There's a lot of complaints in the public sphere about, FOIA taking too long. There really is a solution to this, which is, at least for now, put more people against the requirement. There's just a bandwidth issue. Hopefully, in the future, an automated system will allow people to will allow us to become much more efficient about this, but that takes significant resources as well. And so, I think kind of we're really at this kind of critical juncture. A lot of complaints about the classification system from all parties, which is why we have such a great, we're having such a great bipartisan discussion today with the next panel. But this is something that is not really a political issue in that sense, but still there's not a lot of resourcing.
Yeah, well, and I think it's sort of long-term planning for it. So, one of the things that we've also talked about from a board perspective is really thinking, how do we plan long-term for the challenges that we know are coming? It's absolutely sort of the record-keeping component, and then the classification should be part of that. So how do we think about that comprehensively? And I think, again, that is a nonpartisan issue. These are things that there is agreement on across the board. They're good government proposals. So I think but we really have to do that planning. And it's really easy sometimes to put it off.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, again, hopefully now, and I think really the war in Ukraine has brought this to people's mind, it's not just administrative. I mean, there are real world, very present impacts of not being able to share information within our own government, not being able to share information with partners, some of whom, we've talked to some of these foreign governments, some of our closest allies who have told us that, in one instance that seemed almost absurd, but is true, that I'll just give this as an anecdote, they had a pilot who was flying an American C-5 into Afghanistan. The pilot was on an exchange tour to the U.S. government, one of our closest allies, and the pilot did not have access to the defensive systems of the aircraft, which they would potentially need to land in Kabul, which, as many of you will remember, was not necessarily a safe place to land during the evacuation. And the pilot, this foreign pilot, who's from one of our closest allies, could not have access to the defensive systems of the aircraft because they had been overclassified as no foreign. So hopefully things like that will kind of help get a little bit more momentum going, because we really are going to need our closest allies in this fight with us, especially those from our Five Eyes partners. I think we'll just kind of close this up now, and we'll now go to the next panel, which we have. We will take some questions. Thank you, Carter, one of our board members here. We will take
save all the questions, the hard questions for the next panel.
Save it, yeah.
So you can.
But we'll take some questions. But we are going to start going to the next panel. I'll just say one last thing, closing, and then Alyssa will say one thing, which is that this really is this is an extremely important topic. I know that the idea of declassifying a document can be viewed as dry, but again, what sets us apart from almost every other country around the world is the fact that the public can hold, in theory, the public will be able to hold the government accountable for its actions. And that means the public needs to understand and have an appropriate level of access to what the government's doing, even if it's 50 years later, even if it's a historical look back. It's extremely important that the public have that ability.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with that. The other thing to realize is one of the missions that the board has taken on is really to make sure we hear from people. So one of the things I'm so excited about having the next panel for is really to sort of surface new ideas, think about things that we can recommend, make sure that we have sort of channels for thinking about declassification policy down the road.
Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. So, okay, your hand was up first, then we'll go over here.
Thank you. Dustin Volz, Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much for doing this. Just a couple of quick questions. You mentioned the administration's executive order review that's been going on in earnest since at least the spring, if not earlier. I'm just wondering if you have any sense of how that's going, and specifically if there's a timeline that the administration has in mind for when that might be finalized or close to finalized. And then secondly, speaking of some of the high-profile...
For the next panel, definitely for the next panel.
You mentioned some of the high-profile reviews that you guys have done recently. Among those was a advising the White House that it could or should fully release a classified intelligence report on the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I'm just wondering if there was any response delivered at all to that communication to the executive branch about that recommendation. Thank you.
Take a crack at both, or what do you want?
You can start them.
Okay. So on the executive order, you know, again, we have a bit of a bandwidth problem. The office at the White House on the NSC that is, you know, point for this is not an office of 100 people. It's an office, I think, of, you know, 5 or 10 people, somewhere in between. They've also been working very, very diligently on you know, following the president's executive order on the release of the JFK records, which I think will be happening in the next couple days. There is a deadline approaching, and I understand there could be a lot of progress. So they've been very busy with that. Regarding the executive order, look, these things take time. I mean, I think, you know, every member of the intelligence community, and then every agency that's part of the intelligence community, and then the non-intelligence community elements that generate classified information have to be consulted. And this is an interagency deliberative process. You know, to get people to actually follow the executive order, unfortunately, it helps to have buy-in. And so that's a process that takes time. I'm sure that there will be, you know, disagreements. Again, many of the agencies, and in many cases, there's an interest to have overclassification. And so you are fighting against a natural bureaucratic gravity. And that is a cultural issue. And so this is something that will take time. You know, I'm hopeful that by the spring or in the summer, there'll be something, because I think we really do need this change. And but you know, we'll see, and the board is going to continue to advise on that. On your last question, I can say something on that. Look, the board makes recommendations as the statute dictates. Congress makes a request. If it's sufficiently narrow, we take the request under consideration, we review the document, and then we make a recommendation of the president. Part of our ability to remain independent and be a trusted advisor both to the president and Congress is allowing them the decision space that they need. We've made our recommendation, and I'm sure it's under consideration.
Yeah, no, I agree with that piece. I think the reality is, you know, look, we're an external board that helps advise. We're not writing the executive order. We're not sort of making the decision in the end. So we can only talk to what we can do, and you already have gotten a sense of that.
Okay, we had a question over here.
Michael Binder recently retired from the Air Force Declassification Office. I see there are a lot of lawyers that are members of the PIDB, but I'm wondering how many of them have conducted declassification review for a federal agency, because to the best of my knowledge, declassification review isn't taught in law school.
Yeah. So the board, that's a great question. So the board is really lucky that I think everybody on the board has served time in the intelligence community or at an agency that generates classified information. Most of the members of the board have actually served in a legal capacity in these agencies where they've had to handle, you know, FOIA litigation. Again, they're not the people in the trenches that are doing the really tough work of the line-by-line reviews, and that is hard. And that is, again, by the way, there aren't enough people that have that experience, which is why we think there needs to be an automated system or better resourcing to this problem. But
I actually would take it a little bit differently. This goes back to my point about what the role of the board is. I don't think the role of the board is to do those kinds of classification reviews. And I think we have to think about it that way, right? So we're trying to advise on what policy approaches might be might help. And so the goal is to get actually insight from people who've done them on the ground to think about what the policy changes could look like from an executive order standpoint. So I think there's actually an important role for lawyers in that context.
Well, the reason I asked it is because in looking over recommendations from the PIDB and positions that you take, I see quite a bit of naivete about what we in the trenches encounter. We had a project to try to come up with an automated system. Such a system in the Air Force is not just looking at Air Force classified information, but every other federal agency that classifies information. And the notion that you can come up with an automated system that can do all of the DoD, all of the intelligence community, State Department, DHS, Treasury, it really begs credulity to think that that can actually happen.
But think about how crazy that is, right? And I agree with you. We've had some fascinating briefings thinking about what a single declassification guide for a particular agency would look like. And there is an agency in the IC that's done that. And it was an incredible burden, to your point. So just that was one agency, a single declassification guide that covered the entire agency. And it was an incredible task, but that we have to look forward of what we should be working towards. I agree with you. Thinking that that's easy or thinking that's sort of possible in the near term is absolutely naive. I don't disagree with that at all.
That was one agency.
Let me say one thing in response to that. So that's exactly why, completely agree with you, putting the Air Force or the CIA or the Department of the Army in a position where they're going to have a system that then applies to every agency that generates classified information is ridiculous. But that's exactly why we're saying it needs to be a centralized whole of government effort. Remember, the classification originates from one person, the president, and then it spreads out through the entire government. We need to have something higher up in the kind of the food chain that governs all.
I'll leave it.
Thank you. Okay, any other questions? All right, thank you very much. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and we'll have the next panel up soon. Thank you very much. Great. Oh, let me get my water.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for being here. This is our second panel now. My name's Carter Burwell. I'm one of the newest members, I guess the newest member of the Public Interest Declassification Board, joined earlier this year. I want to again thank the Hudson Institute for hosting us today, and particularly the Federalist Society and the ABA's National Security Working Group for also helping to sponsor this event. As we heard from our chair and vice chair, Ezra Cohen and Alyssa Starzak, it's incredibly important that the PIDB's work is nonpartisan or bipartisan, apolitical. Is there an issue that's facing the federal government? And we're blessed to have a panel of distinguished experts here today to speak with us on this issue and to really offer some legal and policy thoughts and observations about this process. We are, as the Washington Post editorial page said recently, we are drowning in secrets now in the federal government. That, as DNI Haynes said, that this is actually undermining our national security, that the very system that we have in place to protect and defend and support our national security is being undermined by the problems we have with classification, and the trend, as Alyssa and Ezra said, is going in the absolute wrong direction. So I'm very grateful here for these four experts to join us and offer their perspectives. I'll introduce them briefly. Immediately to my left is David Burns. He's a partner at Gibson and Dunn and has experience helping to lead the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. To his left is Professor Alex Joel. He's a professor at the American University School of Law. And he had a record at ODNI in the privacy branch of ODNI and a long experience working on these issues. We're grateful for him to be here. Liza Goitein from the Brennan Center, who has been the Brennan Center, one of the leading outside advocates for transparency, for open government, helping to push the government to be more, to share more of its secrets. And finally, to her left is John Eisenberg. John was Deputy General Counsel in the White House and is legal advisor to the National Security Council and has extensive experience inside the National Security Council, helping to advise the national security on issuing executive orders, pushing them through the system. And we're blessed and fortunate to have all of these folks here today. I thought I would just open it up with a general offer to each one of the panelists to provide their short, succinct, and best recommendation for the National Security Council as it tackles this problem. We know it's public that they're revising these executive orders. And so I'm going to offer Liza the opportunity to go first as our leading advocate for open government to say what you would hope that the National Security Council would do here.
Sure. Wow. That is, okay, so I'm sort of reframing. I was going to lead off with this discussion of the problem of overclassification, the harms that it causes. I think we might all be on board with all of that. So maybe
feel free to start there and lead us into it.
Well, I will add a little bit sort of the discussion that Ezra started about some of the harms of overclassification, because it goes beyond the fact that I think the government feels like it can act with a certain amount of impunity when secrets stay secret forever. It also affects the ability of Americans to participate in the democratic process when they're denied access to information they need for public debate and to know how they want to vote on certain issues. It inhibits the rule of law by providing a shield for government misconduct, which goes to what Ezra was saying. It also it impedes robust checks and balances because it inhibits congressional and judicial oversight, and it undermines public faith in the government. Of course, it also has national security harms in terms of preventing information sharing within government, with private partners, and it harms national security in other ways because the burden of protecting all of this information can cause busy officials to cut corners, or even worse, to lose respect for the system, leak information. So there's just a range of harms. This really needs to be addressed. I think, I'm not going to pick one thing, because you told me I could say whatever I wanted. So we're going to push back on the hypothetical. I do think there's a little bit too much discretion built into the system. There needs to be a healthy amount of discretion at the front end, but it shouldn't be unbounded. So I would be in favor of a White House-led task force of senior agency officials that could be set up by the executive order to develop narrower criteria for classification at the front end and to come up with maybe a more specific definition of damage to the national security. In terms of issues of derivative classification and the fact that it's just so easy for busy, risk-averse officials to just classify information without thinking about it rather than stopping and going through that process. I think it would be helpful at some point to, once the technology is in place to facilitate derivative classification decisions, I think that holds a lot of promise and we need to invest in it. But in the meantime, we need to do something to rebalance the incentives. And I think that requires a system for holding employees accountable when they negligently, persistently, or deliberately overclassify information. So the executive order could require agencies to develop those systems. And then the final thing I'll say, because you said I could say what I wanted, is on the declassification end. Again, I think the ultimate answer is going to be technology. I don't think human review can keep up with the volume of the petabytes of classified information that are being generated, even if you take care of the overclassification problem. So ultimately, I think we'll have to rely on technology. In the meantime, there are things that could be done in the executive order to make automatic declassification actually automatic. And what that really means is ending the endless series of sequential agency equity reviews, which right now makes that process extend out for years, and then there's a pass-fail approach where agencies withhold everything if there's even a single word that's classified. This isn't working, and the executive order could end sequential agency equity reviews and empower the National Declassification Center to simply declassify information at 25 years.
Thank you. John, you help to manage the National Security Council and provide legal advice in the drafting of executive orders. What would you tell this administration, this National Security Council, your colleagues who are, former colleagues who are working through this process? What would you advise them?
I was told there wouldn't be any hard questions, let alone leading off with that. Like, look, it's really hard to put yourself in that role. I mean, as somebody mentioned, maybe it was Ezra, there are, what, 16 or 18 intelligence agencies. The Department of Defense is a beast unto itself. I don't mean that in a bad way. The number of inputs coming in from all sectors of the government itself, let alone from outside the government, is just going to be a massively difficult problem to come to any, to change anything in a profound way. I'm not saying that can't happen. We were involved in a rewrite of 12333, which this was in a prior administration. And I mean, that was the same kind of difficulty. Once you have a document like that that's been running for a long time, there's like almost a truce inside of the government about various parts that one agency is going to be very concerned with, another one won't be, et cetera. So I think overall, I would counsel sort of at least like an incremental approach that actually gets certain things done. And the things I would look at to get done is, I think the problem, and maybe this is from my own ignorance, I think there still is a lot of study that needs to be done on what the potential solutions are. It's hard, other than technological solutions, it's hard to come up with anything that really is too profound. So I guess I would empower somebody in the government to run point on doing that in as quick a manner as plausible, to suggest within the government various ideas to reform the administration and to come up with technological solutions, and they have to be empowered. They have to have access to information that they would need to get that done. That would be high up on my list. The other thing is, right now we are where we are for a reason. the Supreme Court said it's obvious and unarguable that no interest is as compelling as the national security. And everybody who holds clearances, I mean, this is inculcated, and for good reason, from day one. The definition of top secret involves, the unauthorized disclosure is reasonably expected to cause exceptionally grave harm to the damage to the national security. SCI would throw in that it's irreparable. So anybody holding this information, I mean, it's terrifying initially to do it, and not even initially, but after years and years, it's terrifying. We tell people there are criminal prohibitions if they mishandle. They can lose their job, they could go to prison. It's going to be very difficult to change the balance of what individuals feel. And you have to ask how much you really want to, because again, like the consequences are very dire. So I guess I would suggest that we start looking at this more and more as national security versus national security balancing. As people have said, like there are real national security harms to overclassification, and I think the government needs to look at that more and come to some kind of consensus on what those harms are, so that it's not national security versus openness. I mean, openness is it's the most critical thing in a democracy. But when you can turn this into a national security versus national security balance, I think that we're going to make a lot more progress towards declassification when people buy into that and see that. So,
given your experience in the National Security Council, one of the things that Ezra and Alyssa talked about was to really put someone at point, maybe an OMB, or over top the intelligence community, the constituent organizations. Do you think that's a path forward? Would you recommend that?
I don't have enough experience to know what the pitfalls are for where it currently is. I mean, OMB is certainly a reasonable place to put it. That there's obviously access to, first of all, the National Security Council, the president, and I mean all the key players are right there. So that does seem like a reasonable thing, and may elevate sort of its ability to get everything done if it's there. Yeah.
I'll turn to you, Professor Joel. You have the ability now to direct the National Security Council and guide this new executive order. What are your top recommendations for the folks who are writing this executive order?
Thank you for according me such power.
I don't know that you want to thank it.
Well, I think the first thing is to view the problem holistically, which I think the PIDB is doing. I mean, it is, what we're facing right now is an exponentially growing mass of classified information. And as Esther pointed out, with the onset of the digital age, it's going to be beyond the capacity of human beings acting alone to process in the way that we've currently been processing things or have been processing things. So you have this ever-growing corpus of classified information, and then you have, I'll call them irrational demand signals, because you have whatever FOIA litigation is going on, taxing the same resources, right? And whoever chooses to file a lawsuit, which is, they should have the right to file a lawsuit, I'm not saying they shouldn't, but that jumps, those requests to the top of the line. You've got the 25-year declassification review, you have the mandatory declassification reviews, you have whatever priorities the intelligence agencies and the president feel are important for foreign affairs purposes or other purposes, and you have upcoming reauthorizations of different statutes, which then also drive pull from the same limited group of people. And so in order to tackle this whole thing, you have to think, okay, how am I going to deal with the continued growth of this corpus? How am I going to help the people working on it get through it more quickly? So I think that you have to look at it at the big picture. And one of the buzzwords that I'm very familiar with, because I championed this so much when I was in government, is transparency. And I think transparency is a word that should be embraced by the PIDB and embraced in the new executive order as something that looks at the whole of the cycle with the view toward how do we make sure that we protect secrets that need to be protected, but at the same time provide transparency to the public. And it sounds like just big words, but you can then have to tackle that problem, step by step. And I will say that to be credible in attacking the problem, you have to recognize the importance of maintaining national security secrets. And I think we use the term overclassification. I use the term overclassification. It can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But I do want to stress that the system is working logically and rationally, right? So the system is, we're going to create a trusted area where people with clearances can work on computers that we've vetted and can freely share information, except subject to agency equities and dissemination controls and all other kinds of issues, but theoretically can share information within a trusted circle without having to worry all the time about whether this word or that word ought to be classified or not classified. And as a result, and given all of the consequences of releasing information that could harm national security, yes, you're going to create a situation where people are freely exchanging information and marking it in ways to keep it within this trusted circle. And it's resulted in a huge corpus, like I said, of information that may be marked inappropriately, but it's a logical and rational outgrowth. And so in order to have credibility in tackling that, I think you have to recognize that the people working the system aren't there to, hide things because they're embarrassed by them. Maybe some people are, but in my experience, that wasn't the issue. It was really them acting rationally in accordance with how the system was set up to operate. And so we have to sort of start tackling that piece by piece. And the last thing I'll say is, for the Public Interest Declassification Board, the declassification, there should be a separate section in the new executive order on declassification. There should be standards and categories and processes and procedures. It should be more than a sentence. There ought to be a public interest declassification section to the new executive order with its own set of processes and procedures.
Thank you. David, you helped lead the National Security Division at the Department of Justice. You, every day, were dealing with the import and consequences of national security decisions, of prosecutions, and the consequences when national security information became public. With that perspective, what would you counsel or guide the National Security Council or the President as they think about amending this executive order?
Yeah, it's certainly a daunting problem, and I joked in advance that I think I'm better qualified to talk about the problem than the solutions. Look, I think there are some universal truths, right? Transparency and openness, I think we all agree, are critical to our democracy. At the same time, the world's a dangerous place, and there are adversaries who want to do us harm, and there may be overclassification. I think that's correct, but America today, currently, justifiably has a lot of secrets, and a lot of important secrets that need to remain that way for at least some time. I think in terms of solutions, what we saw in National Security Division prosecution, so we would prosecute leaks of national defense information, often classified information, and we would. This is information that has been leaked and is out in the public, but which no one wanted to say was in fact true and correct government information until it became declassified. And the problems became when you'd go to one IC component and to another IC component, and where there were multiple equities, you'd have one that would sign off after a lot of debate and back and forth, and another after a lot of debate and back and forth on the exact same information would come to a different conclusion. So I think one solution would be, I think, having a body with below the president with ultimate authority over the entire process and the ability to make decisions to declassify after consultation, but without requiring sign-off. We saw a little bit of this in the last administration, where Attorney General Barr was given authority to declassify in a number of different areas, and after a lot of consultation was able ultimately to do that. In the Mueller investigation report and the Carter Page FISA materials, ultimately there was declassification. But short of having someone with decision-making ability that has the time and resources, again, below the office below the president, to make those decisions and live and have the country live with the consequences, I think it becomes very challenging.
I'll invite discussion amongst the panel about whether we've heard a lot about overclassification and we've heard a lot about declassification. If you had to focus on one of those two problems, which one would you focus on? Which one should we focus on? Is it the input or the output?
That's a false choice, I think. And they obviously relate very directly to one another. I mean, part of the burden on the declassification system is the problem of overclassification. So, and I think the solution that holds the most promise for declassification is the same solution I think that holds a lot of promise for derivative classification, which is technology-assisted classification and declassification, which could help not only with sort of speeding up the process, but could give people in that safe space that you were talking about the comfort to not reflexively classify everything if they knew that there was this automated system that was going to identify and flag really sensitive information. And so they had this kind of safety net to enable them to not default to classification for everything. So I think, yeah, I think the problems are linked. I think the solutions are linked, and even if they weren't, I would resist, because they are flip sides of a singular problem of unnecessary secrecy that is causing, I think, a lot of harm, while fully recognizing that there are secrets that need to be kept secret, and that is also of the highest importance.
Yeah, I would add that I agree with what Liza just said. And again, I like the emphasis on technology assisted, because to people who are worried about the technology automatically making classification or declassification decisions, I don't think we're anywhere near there yet. But there's certainly room to experiment with different systems. And I will say that this as much as we're focused on cultural attitudes toward classification in my experience as the intelligence community, we've come a long way. I mean, after 9/11, there was a huge pressure on right to release and sharing information and getting information out to state and local partners who didn't have clearances, who didn't have SCIFs. So this whole idea of writing to the lowest classification level has been, part of the culture in the intelligence agencies. And I feel like we just need to continue to push on that culture, to continue to get people focused on that. And you're right, that will release pressure. I do think another pressure release mechanism is on the output side, on declassification, categorizing things, having the ability to prioritize and categorize. So I think the historians have a huge interest in the older information, and that's great, and there ought to be, if I had my druthers, there would be a channel for historical declassification. And the historians could get in there and look at the 25-year-old material and focus on that. And then there would be a separate channel, related, but sort of conceptually separate category for current public interest declassification, which would include national security. So if it's in the nation's national security interest to declassify and share information about Russia's invasion of Ukraine, then that ought to be part of it. If it's in the national interest, and it is in the public interest to learn more about authorities that are coming up for reauthorization, that should be prioritized, and there ought to be no debate about it. It should be very clear that this fits in this category, and therefore we are going to prioritize resources on it.
Sorry, were you going to say something? I don't want to take up too much airspace here, but I just did want to say that I like Alex's idea of having a separate section in the executive order on public interest declassification.
What do you think some of the best sources are for identifying what is the public interest in declassification?
I think the public is a wonderful source for that.
Polling, Twitter, should we use Twitter polls? Or?
I didn't really mean it that way, but so what I had in mind is a couple of different things, but one is to create, within the MDR system, to create a fast track that's similar to the fast track that exists in FOIA, where requests are expedited if the requester can show a compelling need. The way that's defined in FOIA is an urgency to inform the public about actual or alleged federal government activity. So that is the sort of current events standard. Of course, it's subjective, and we are, even though it's the public that will nominate issues of overriding public interest, it's obviously going to be the agency and then ultimately ISCAP that makes a decision of which things meet that standard, which current events, which information meets that standard. But to at least have that track to sort of expedite the declassification of information of high public interest. And then at the same time, and this is a slightly conceptually different idea, right now there is no mechanism for members of the public to request public interest declassification. In other words, the declassification of information that still meets the standard for declassification, but should be released in the public interest. So even though original classification authorities, with the approval of the agency, can perform such a review, there's no way for a member of the public to request it and have it done through the MDR process all the way up to ISCAP. And I would change that. I would make it easier for members of the public to say, hey, this may be legitimately classified, but we think it should be released in the public interest, to have that trigger a mandatory review process that would go all the way up to ISCAP, I think would also be helpful.
One thing is, as I said initially, I would counsel caution and sort of an incremental approach. One thing I would think is a problem is, Snowden, for example, set things back a lot. Before Snowden, I think that's the genesis of a massive compartmentation problem. I mean, a program, an area that would have had one compartment, everything would have been in the same compartment before Snowden, turns into 25 compartments or more. For every like a new missile, you'd have like the fins and the guidance. All those would be separately compartmented now. So I'd be afraid that like one incident like that will massively set back everything that we're trying to do. So I would just, in essence, I would just recommend caution in going forward.
Do you think Congress has a role in this to play in identifying what's in the public interest and what should be the focus?
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I think so. One thing there's some things we can just legislate, quote unquote, regulate or order, are in the public interest, and one would be, in my view, to echo something Liza has been arguing, secret law. So there ought to be a priority. Now some legal opinions have to be classified. Sometimes they're so intertwined with classified facts you cannot release them. All of that stuff is absolutely correct, and I fully support. But in terms of a priority review, there ought to be a priority review done of anything that talks about the legal authorities that agencies operate under, the specific rules that they operate under, and compliance with those rules, and the oversight process for those rules. And I think that's essential for public trust. And it's essential for trust among our foreign partners right now. We're engaged in a lot of discussions with countries overseas whose legal systems are judging our legal system. And one area where I do not allow for comparison, well, of course we can compare anything we want, but the US is far ahead, in my view, of other countries in transparency, in being public about what our national security activities are. When you compare that to how other countries are doing things, we're just miles apart. And that's not all due to the goodwill of hardworking people, but external events have sometimes forced that on the US. But that's been huge progress, and we have to continue to make that progress, and the most important part is the law. We're a country that operates under the rule of law. So I think that one you can just put in there. Doesn't mean it gets automatically released, but it's a priority for people to look at.
You mean some of these OLC memos that have become the focus of attention?
No, I don't. I mean, OLC is certainly part of that, but that's not been the main focus for me. It's really been the legal interpretations. Obviously, the FISA court is already under a mandate to do that, which is great. I think that's important. And I think part of that is also when you're writing these documents that are once you have more clarity about what's in the public interest, when the people are creating those documents, they can create them in ways that they understand could be publicly released. So you'd have unclassified text with classified annexes if necessary, or whatever there's all these familiar tools that people have in the intelligence community to write to release, write to the lowest order of classification, help. Then when you do release the opinion, it's comprehensible. It doesn't disclose classified information. If it's possible. It may not be possible to do that, but at least that becomes a priority.
As an alum of OLC, I have to say, I felt like OLC did a pretty good job of this, at least in the last administration. I'm not being critical of the current one, I just don't really know where it stands now. For example, with use of force in Syria, OLC intentionally wrote its opinion on the legality of that using public information so that it could be released sort of in real time, and it was. And I think, I mean, they've made a lot of effort in that regard.
We talked about a little bit, Ezra and Alyssa talked about Ukraine and the proactive declassification and sharing of information. Is that you know, a parallel, a model to use going forward for the government?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start. I mean, I think prioritizing certain categories certainly makes a lot of sense, and the Ukrainian information is a good example of when there's an incentive and an interest and a top-down push, it can get done. The problem is there's so many different categories, right? It's identifying where to prioritize on the back end. I still think, I think the problem is at the front end, and that's what's really daunting. I think leveraging technology makes a lot of sense. At least in theory, it'd be interesting to see, who's developing, those algorithms, and of course they have to have then access to all of the same classified information and spend a lot of time with those who are in those programs and understand the nature of the programs and why it's classified. And then I just think, practically speaking, and I don't think it's because of ill will, frankly, or even negligence in most cases. But when you are working in a SCIF day in and day out, and you're sending emails back and forth, and you're dealing with a lot of different categories of classified information, it's like the adage in criminal cases that it's better that 100 or 99 guilty defendants are set free than one innocent defendant go to jail. Well, it's quite dangerous to have an important piece of information underclassified that gets out, and there are real consequences. So when you are moving very quickly, dealing in a lot of different programs at the same time, going through your inbox potentially, and responding to communications, it is certainly always the safest to err on the side of a higher classification. That creates a lot of issues, and that's the sort of thing that we need to figure out how to address.
Can I just piggyback off of that? I feel like I'm taking too much airtime, but I do think it's helpful to categorize as well, not just in terms of priorities for declassification, but also the types of documents that we're talking about, right? So your example of emails, I mean, we all produce tons and tons of emails, so that's huge volume if that all has to be reviewed. Is there a way, and I haven't given this a huge amount of thought, but is there a way of well, let me just contrast that with a finished analytic product. Like, it could be an OLC opinion. It could be, this is the document that we've all spent a lot of time working on, and this is the sum of what we believe. Now, there's all the deliberative emails and drafting that go into it that might have all been marked or overmarked, but now we have this document. And this document is one that we can and should focus on to make sure that it was done properly, and people do, right? People spend, for some of these finished products, people spend a lot of time going through portion marking it properly and having debates about whether it's portion marked properly. But all the emails, all the drafts, all the working documents, is that really the priority? I mean, yes, you want to be able to access some of that because I'm sure there's really interesting stuff there, but it's that, from a practical perspective, it's that finished product that is most impactful and easiest to focus on. And by the same token, there's all kinds of operational traffic that agencies do to set up an operation and run an operation. Is that ever going to be fully, is that worthy of a lot of time to make sure that that's all portion marked properly when they're talking about setting up something that's clearly highly sensitive and classified? So I would just urge us to find ways to practically harness what we have to focus on what is the most important.
So another way to do that perhaps is, and I sound like a broken record player. I said that to my kids and they were like, what?
As a record player, I don't understand.
But it is technology and systems for tagging classified information when you classify it with various standardized metadata, which could include something about the category of information and the priority level for declassification. I mean, that would be part of a very complex set of considerations and would not be easy or straightforward to implement, but it is one sort of way of getting to that. I would also maybe think about building in the public interest really very much at the front end, not just at the declassification stage, by making explicit that an original classification authority can take public interest into account. I think that's implicit right now because the executive order says that OCAs may classify information that meets the certain criteria. It doesn't say that they shall or they must classify that information, but the executive order could make it explicit that even at the front end, there needs to be some kind of public interest weighing, and maybe maybe ultimately the OCA decides to go ahead and classify, but maybe they tag it as something of high public interest, and that can facilitate a later declassification. There's one other thing I was going to say about that sort of upfront process, and I forget what it is, but hopefully I'll remember later.
That strikes me as a difficult thing to put on at least a lot of OCAs. I mean, OCAs come in all different stripes, but the people who are doing the most classification are probably not at the highest, at a high level to know how do I balance public interest versus the fact that releasing information is expected to cause exceptionally grave, serious, or damage at least to the national security. That's putting a lot on them.
It's true, but those same people are entrusted under the current executive order with making exactly that calculus in the declassification context, and it's the same calculus. But again, I think if there were uncertainty, what they could do is just tag it as being something of high public interest. I remembered what I was going to say, which is that another sort of way to help maximize the amount of information that can get out, even on classified subjects, when it's of high public interest, is to follow the model of the National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency, which requires classifiers under its security classification guide, classifiers for each line item in the guide. They have to include a value statement, a damage statement, and an unclassified statement. And the value statement explains the reasons for classification. The damage statement describes the damage that could be expected if the information were released. And the unclassified statement guides whoever is using this information on how they can actually communicate the information in an unclassified way. So that approach, I think, could be picked up and used by other agencies, I think, to good effect.
Follow up on what Alex said. It strikes me that until there is a technological solution, which I think everyone rightly thinks is the silver bullet here, that focusing resources on more meaningful declassification may be a better way to go in the short term anyhow. There is going to be a lot of stuff that's just not historically as important as the finished product. And I think if you focus on that material, you may get a lot more of the important stuff out in the public than you would if you were, if reviewers had to go through all of the background material as well.
I think maybe just a few minutes more until we open it up to questions. We've been going now for almost 45 minutes. I want to make sure to give you all the opportunity to raise anything that you feel like you haven't covered.
To go the other direction for a second, I don't know how much effort is going into sort of understanding, if you release, if you take a piece of information just by itself, it may look fairly innocuous. I know of one example, I just don't know of how to say it in a way that I can say here. But when you know that the rest of the stuff—
Don't worry about it, just go ahead.
I'm sure it'll all be fine because all those incentives for overclassification don't apply. Oh no. But when you know what the mosaic is of everything that's already been released, that one piece of information turns out to be extremely sensitive. So, and we have the same sort of thing with big data, right? Like even in the unclassified world, the amount of information that we disgorge that, adversaries can like distill just incredible amounts of stuff from is a little bit scary. So I wonder how much effort is being put into understanding exactly that problem.
So if I can just, I'll make a pitch for additional resources. And I know that that's not within your mandate, but this is an under-resourced area, and I think it will always be at risk of under-resourcing because it competes with mission. And as long as it's under-resourced, we can talk as much as we want, but it'll be under a huge amount of stress, and that stress is growing exponentially with these mandatory clocks that they have to deal with in the executive order. So we have to take, they need more resources, but no amount of resources will be enough. So it has to be smartly applied more resources. Let me make it clear, more resources, but there has to be some strategic thinking in terms of how that works. And I like the idea of a program office. You know, part of resources is having people whose full-time job it is to focus on something. And that's their job, that's how they're evaluated. What did you make progress? And if you have full-time people working on this problem at a government-wide level who are held accountable for results, and then who can then go out and have other allies at the agency level whose job it is to also do the same thing at the agency level, I think you can start making progress if they have some freedom to come up with new ideas and work on new ways of thinking about all of the problems that we've had, try and innovate with pilot, different technologies. If they have the funding, the resources, and the organizational clarity. I'm not talking about moving deck chairs on the Titanic, although maybe we are on a Titanic, but it's organizational clarity. Like, who is responsible for this? What parts of the bureaucracy do they have to touch? What are the responsibilities of those parts of the bureaucracy to cooperate and to fully support what is being done by the people whose job it is to do this? That kind of organizational clarity is important, and you could try to get somewhere there with the executive order.
And maybe just very briefly to talk about the consequences of getting this wrong. And I know what we're talking about is not early on disclosure of highly sensitive information. It's a very thoughtful process down the road or at the origin. But just having worked on leaks of national security cases, I mean, we certainly saw instances where human sources were lost or methods were lost because of leaks. And that might mean that it's difficult to recruit someone else going forward. It might mean that particular country A that has particular intentions, now our access to critical information about that country, we go dark in certain respects. So there are significant consequences to these decisions.
I guess the one thing that I would just underscore, which I touched on earlier, is that in light of the fact that it is going to take some time to have a workable technology-assisted declassification system in place, we cannot wait however many years it's going to take to have that in place, because right now the tsunami of classified information, digitally classified information, that is completely overwhelming the declassification system is only growing. And it is breaking the system. It has broken the system. Declassification is broken. And we can't just say we're going to leave it that way for a few years. So I think, as I said before, the answer has to be real changes to the automatic declassification system. If the administration doesn't want to completely end agency equity review and empower the National Declassification Center to just simply declassify all the information or the information that doesn't qualify for an exemption at 25 years, then there should be a tight deadline, and agencies should be, the information should be referred to agencies concurrently, not sequentially. They should be given a short period of time, 6 months, to perform their reviews. And that will not only force the agencies to move a little faster, but it will focus their attention on the documents that are the most likely to contain sensitive information. It will force them to do the prioritization that they're probably in the best position to do. There's no such thing as a no-risk approach. That is unattainable, and it has brought the system to its knees. We need a risk management approach, and something like what I'm talking about, I think, is the way to do that in the interim while we wait for the technology to come and save us.
Well, on that note, I think it's important to open up the floor to questions. Before I do, though, I wanted to remind folks that in January, the PIDB is going to have a conference, a much larger conference at the University of Texas. The Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, is going to come speak at, I think it's January 26th and 27th. Senator Cornyn is going to come and speak to us. We're going to have a variety of panels to address the technology that we think will come and save us. We're going to hear from academics, including the presidential libraries there in Texas, who have a lot of equities these issues as well. And so we're not, this is not it. There'll be even a more fulsome and extensive discussion of these issues in January. So thanks for being here and stay tuned. But Adam, I saw you raise your hand, and we have a microphone coming for you.
Thanks. I'll make a point and ask a question. One point is the way to maximize public interest is through the media. I know nobody wants to hear that.
We appreciate you being here and helping us draw attention to this issue.
I know. I just wanted to be explicit. But this question is for John. If I had more time, I'd have one for you too, Dave. But John,
the moderator may exercise a prerogative to.
Sorry, my beeper just went off.
John, we've heard a lot about the declassification process today, and how it occurs, and who can declassify. One thing that interests me, and there's been a lot of talk about it, is how, if you could walk us through, right, without any specific instances, how does a president declassify information? We talked about hypothetically, Barr declassification authority. He could do that. But why do we need Barr if we have a president? And if you could just sort of hypothetically walk us through what a president needs to do to declassify material.
Why you need the AG or some other person is because of everything that the president is doing. It's not a legal requirement to have the AG do it. It's a practical requirement of having somebody who has time, and not necessarily that the AG has a lot of spare time, but more than the president, because the president's got everything on his plate. Probably an outlier here, but as a legal matter, I think the president just has to state that he is declassifying, at least in general. There are specific statutes and a few other considerations that I think can come to play in particular matters. But just as a general matter, all of this is under the president's authority, outside of these couple of examples counterexamples. And if the president says something is declassified, in my view, it's declassified. Now, what as a matter of prudence what steps should be gone through? There's a lot. There's a reason why there's equity checks and things like that, because the sensitivity of information may not be apparent to just one person on the face of the information. It's only when you understood where it came from or whatever other considerations, and that's why it's so important to go through that process. But as a legal matter, I think the president can just say, with respect to most information, it's declassified.
That gets at my question. So the president says I can declassify it. That's fine. That's understood. But then there's still a declassification process to go through the particular agencies. They get a chance to push back and say, hey, we would like the president to consider not classifying this data.
As a legal matter or a practical matter? Hopefully as a practical matter, sure. That's the equities check, right? That a specific agency may know why something is so sensitive, and it may not be apparent, and it's useful to know that. But as a legal matter, this is all done under the EO is issued under the president's authority, and an executive order is an order from the president to his subordinates. So if he wants to do something differently, that's up to the president generally. Now, again, there are specific pieces of information that are governed by more complicated systems, but just in general.
Alex, did you want to chime in? Or?
The last thing, when the president does that, there is a written record of it, correct?
There should be, sure.
Should be, right.
But as a legal matter, does there need to be? No, take a hypothetical where president is aware of a piece of information all of a sudden that there's an imminent attack on one of our allies. Surely the president can pick up, and if all there is an unclassified phone, he can pick that phone up and call the right people in the other country and tell them that, no matter how classified. That's his decision.
So I guess this just highlights, in my view, the importance of building out the declassification side of the executive order. So a new executive order ought to deal with all of these kinds of scenarios, not every scenario, but it ought to have a process in place. So one of the things for declassification that I think would be helpful to have actually built into the executive order, and unless I've been misreading it, I don't actually see it in the order itself, is a consultation process with the other agencies who have equities that we know goes on in practice. I don't see it in the executive order, and I think building out in a transparent way who has the ability to declassify, what process will be followed, will there be documentation, I think is really important, because if the president or anybody has declassified something and an individual in an agency doesn't know that, then it's not, actually having the impact. Or if they haven't declassified it, but they've just, made a decision on disseminating it to a particular foreign leader under the expectation that it will be held in confidence, and yet through maybe an unclassified channel or something, that's a different thing. I mean, they haven't declassified that for the public. They have made a decision they basically instantly read somebody in, right? They've decided this person can see the document. So I think it's important for the executive order to be more explicit on those issues.
Adam, I think your question also begs the question of what we mean by declassification. I mean, when you declassify something, when you classify something, you're applying protections to the information based on its sensitivity. When you declassify it, you're removing those protections. So to say you declassified it, but there's no record and you didn't tell anybody, it's kind of like saying you ordered food at a restaurant when you thought about what you wanted but didn't tell the waiter, right? You didn't order food. I'm sorry. That part of ordering food is that communication.
Right, but in that hypothetical, you do need to tell the person that, I mean, you haven't ordered food from somebody unless you've told them.
And I'm saying you haven't declassified information if you've only thought about it. I mean, we're just talking in hypotheticals that may not be what your question was getting to at all.
Thank you. I see a couple other questions in the back.
Can I say one thing? I mean, like, there's a difference in the legal issue in a law school, like, exam kind of thing, between, like, whether it's declassified and in the real world of practicalities, and whether you have, like, a shred of evidence to support your claim that you thought about it, right? Like, the answer to that question may be no, even if in fact you have.
I mean, we're probably saying the same thing in different ways. Dustin has a question.
And these issues have macro consequences and micro consequences, but these consequences are important every day, and they're growing, as Liza said, and as the Washington Post said, we're drowning in secrecy. And I'm not sure who had their hand up next, but why don't you go ahead there?
Thank you. I'm Sandra Salvatore, and I appreciate everything you've brought up, because particularly on the TTPs for the declassification section, as having lived it, you can put a policy in place, but if the incentives are still for the senior leadership to say no, even though your analysts may want to post it as a lower declassification, it needs some way of getting into a way of at least some kind of adjudication, even within an agency, to fight for. And I was the OSINT chief for AFRICOM, UCOM, and also DIA, and I constantly was fighting the fact that I'm like, yeah, but this is already an open source, which was good and bad in a way, because I can provide you anything almost, increasingly more so because of the way that we've got public-private partnerships and such, but I can provide an example of something in the open source space, which was great, because when you're sharing with partners, that's our low-hanging fruit. It's the easiest way to share with partners. I can find you the OSINT thing, but at the same time. So I guess my kind of question is has there been consideration of having people who have OSINT expertise in these discussions, in the development of the order, because that they provide a way of perhaps solving a problem in a way, because if you focus on not so much the what, because the what's going to be out there, it's the how that you want to protect. And focus, really narrow in on it. That way you can better adjudicate as you look at data. And I would also say, I agree, the systems help, but the system can only do, once you got to get the framework in place, the TDPs and the policies and the training and such, then the systems can support that. But I was just curious if you've considered having open source expertise on the board.
I don't know about the board, but I will just say that on the open source issue, that you phrased it exactly correctly, the difference between the what and the how, right? So you will get people who will correctly argue that, it may be out in open source, but the fact that we have it is a different, matter. In that, that if providing this reveals that we have it, and then the question will be, how did we get it, versus pointing to open source. The other issue I hear with open source is that by pointing to this piece of open source, I'm verifying that I believe that that's an accurate piece. So, but you're correct that if it's not a matter of the how, but if it's a matter of the what, and the what is already out there, then that should definitely be part of the conversation. And the OSINT people are very good at knowing the what aspect of that. So I think they should be part of it myself.
I have a funny story or comment, not like the pilot trying to land at Bagram, but you know, a colleague of mine likes to share the story that, you know, he was reviewing classified documents and the embassy had sent back to the United States a newspaper article from a local newspaper. And that, of course, was classified.
Yep.
And it was classified because the fact that the embassy believed this newspaper article merited a return to State Department headquarters, that was a matter of national security. And certainly that seems challenging today. But I want to make sure we've got one more question back there, and then thank you guys for being here.
Thank you so much, Dustin Volz, Wall Street Journal, again. I want to channel public interest, actually, and go back to the previous question asked by my esteemed colleague, Adam. And just, John, if I may, I'm curious if you are aware of...
Exercise a moderator's prerogative.
It's a very quick question, I promise.
Thank you.
I'm just curious if you are aware of any instances when you were in the administration where there was a declassification order from the president and there was not any sort of record of it, written or otherwise.
I obviously can't talk about, you know, what did or didn't happen confidentially. So.
We're grateful for John to come and be here as a subject matter expert on the process and his service in the
I'm
national.
not really here, and my name is not really John.
That's also classified, and he's appearing in disguise. But sorry, Dustin, I don't really want to step on your question because it is a matter of public interest, and it is, you know, obviously the classification process and the declassification process is a subject of immediate concern right now. I think the board is really interested in having a productive conversation to try and address these issues at a macro level, and it's challenging because politics is affecting national security so much now that it's a difficult place to operate in. But we're trying, and we appreciate you and your colleagues, you know, keeping this as a matter of public interest, and, you know, to help the board do so. So I don't mean to dodge your question, and I'm really grateful for John and everybody for being here. One more question now. Got a microphone coming for you, and thank you.
When you're looking at using automation to help, you know, really assist the human making decisions, one of the issues that you sort of see in public right now, I mean, algorithms are, of course, very much in the public discussion when you look at social media. And one of the big issues with that is the lack of transparency in the algorithms themselves, which sort of undermine the credibility of the output. How do you build in enough transparency in how the algorithms work when they're making these, not really determinations, but helping to categorize, that not only build confidence within the agencies and the users, but also to the public?
So, yeah, it was. I mean, this may or may not be responsive, so you can tell me, but I think it's important to clarify that I don't think any of us are talking about, certainly not talking about using artificial intelligence or machine learning to engage in original classification decisions, right? Like that requires an element of human judgment that cannot be replaced. And so that will remain a human endeavor. So what we're talking about is... They're both. So what we're talking about is basically matching sort of what is in classification guides and declassification guides against whatever text is being produced to try to find where the matches are. And I am not a technologist. I feel like that should be relatively straightforward in terms of the algorithm versus what you're talking about with social media, where you're predicting who is a terrorist somehow with God knows what considerations and inputs. I think the inputs of these guides and classification and declassification guides compared against the text should be fairly straightforward, but I could be wrong.
And I'll just say also, the intelligence community has developed principles for AI ethics, and they have a framework for it. And so clearly, the intelligence agencies are and should be interested in leveraging, modern technology for mission purposes. And I think what we're suggesting is that they also leverage that for the classification and declassification purposes.
I want to thank our panelists for being here. I want to thank again the Hudson Institute for being here. You guys can't see this, but right out the window down there is the National Archives that's struggling with these issues without as much resources as they need. So hopefully folks in the executive branch are listening, and we look forward to having more discussion in January in Austin. So thank you all very much.